In today's lecture, we will discuss the nervous system. In part 1, we will look at neurons and their function. So, the nervous system are mainly made up by two types of cells, neurons and neuroglia. Neurons are the functional cells. Neuroglia are the surrounding support cells. Neurons help transmit messages, impulses, and help communicate. Neuroglia provides nutrition, provides structure, provides support, and also they help maintain the blood-brain barrier. The nervous system can also be divided into two main components: the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system, that includes the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. These are the nerves that connect other parts of the body to the central nervous system. Again, the central nervous system will have the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system will contain these cranial nerves, the nerves that come out of the brain, and then we'll have the spinal nerves that come out or originate from the spinal cord. It is important to know that there are 12 pairs of cranial nerve, so total 24. In each of these, each level, there are two cranial nerves going to the left and the right. Similarly, for spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming at different levels of the spinal cord. Again, looking at different divisions of the nervous system, we can also divide it into a sensory division and a motor division. The sensory division will contain nerves that help with sensation, bringing in sensory information back to the central nervous system. Then we will also have the motor division, which is subdivided into somatic and autonomic nervous system, which that means is somatic, we can control it. Autonomic is not under our control. So skeletal nervous system will take messages to the skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system will take messages to both the smooth muscles and cardiac muscles. So another way to think about this is sensory receptors or sensory nerves bring messages to the central nervous system. The motor neurons or the motor division takes messages away from the central nervous system to the body, mainly for muscle movement. So let's talk about these different types of neurons and what their functions are. The sensory function, sensory neurons have a sensory function. This is where they will receive information from the outer environment. They gather all these information as detecting changes, and this information is brought back to the central nervous system. Then we have an integrative function. So these are nerve system which will help make sense of the stimuli, of the information that was brought from the sensory nerves to the CNS. Here they will coordinate the information. They can create sensation, memory, and thoughts. And once a decision has been made, they will help take this decision back to the functional organs. And that will be done by the motor function, depending upon what decisions or what thoughts, what actions were determined by the integrative function of the nervous system. Impulses will be carried out both to muscles and glands to carry out certain functions. We already talked about somatic and autonomic. Somatic will transmit voluntary instructions, so we are controlling those movements. Autonomic nerves or the autonomic nervous system will transmit instruction to smooth muscle cells, cardiac cells, and glands, which we don't have control or voluntary control over. Now let's look at a neuron, the functional cell of the nervous system. The neuron like every other cells, will have uh, the cell membrane, the cytoplasm. It will have certain structures, structural differences, and there will be specific names that will be given associated to the neurons in the nervous system. So the cell body will be called soma. This contains the nucleus, the cytoplasm, the organelles, neurofilaments, and even small substances known as nissel bodies. Dendrite are small podia, like finger-like projections that will branch out from the surface of the neuron. And then you have an axon, which is also a branching, but which is a much longer structure compared to these many dendrites. So looking at a visual representation, we see the cell body containing the nuclei, some of these nissel bodies, and we have one long axon, and then we have many dendrites with our shorter branches that branch out from the cell body. And we also talk about Schwann cells. These are some support cells that will wrap themselves around these axons, forming something called a myelin sheet. And we'll discuss more about this in part 2 of this lecture. Again, look at some of these structures we mentioned. This is uh, a, a, a neuron cell looking under high magnification. We see these nissel substances, these small substances that are part of the cell body. We have this axon that's shown right here, and the area where the cell body converges into the axon is also called the axon hillock. Soma is another name for the cytoplasm that's part of the cell body. And then we have the dendrites, which are the short branches, podia-like structures from the cell. And you have the nucleus and the nucleolus as well. So let's discuss a little bit about myelination of an axon. Myelination of an axon is done by the Schwann cells. Schwann cells are known as several different names depending upon whether it's part of the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system, PNS. And their function is to surround these axon-like structures so that they help these transmission of messages rather than going through the entire axon to help jump from these spaces between these axons. And those spaces are called nodes of Ranvier. Here we will introduce it, but in part 2 we'll see this function a little bit more. And depending upon whether these Schwann cells wrap the axons, we will have myelinated axons and unmyelinated axons. Myelinated axons mean areas or axons that have these Schwann cells wrapped around them, and unmyelinated axons will have no Schwann cells wrapped around them. And this is important because this will determine the conduction speed of messages going through the axon. So let's look at some clinical application. What are some diseases that can happen when these myelin sheets, these Schwann cells, disintegrate or don't function properly? In a normal nerve cell, we will have these myelin sheets. In a disease known as multiple sclerosis, there is a destruction of these myelin sheets. So you have this destruction, and with this destruction, now the axons are unable to carry out these messages in a very systematic manner, and that can have some problems with the motor neurons, with the muscle structures that they are taking the messages to, and cause atrophy, like reduction in size of those muscles. Now, depending upon where we have these axons, whether it's unidirectional, whether it's multidirectional, or whether the cell body is even separated out, these nerve cells can be classified, and we will see these in different parts of our body. For this course, we will not focus too much on these different types or which locations we will be finding them. But as long as you know that axons and the cell body is not only this structure, that there could be an axon and some long dendrites, and even the cell body being separate from the axon and the dendrites, um, we know that there will be different types of nerve cells. We've already seen this a little bit, but this is just bringing all the information together again. The sensory neurons are the one that will be afferent. Afferent means coming in. Afferent neurons bringing in messages to the central nervous system. Interneurons are the ones that connect the sensory neurons with the motor neurons. They are the ones that help synthesize information, and they will tend to be multipolar. And motor neurons are the ones that carry messages away from the central nervous system to the muscles or the glands. And these are important to form this loop, or how the central nervous system functions or interacts with the peripheral nervous system. We will continue this lecture in part 2 next.